Matthew Conolly, MD, is currently Professor of Medicine and Anesthesiology here at UCLA Medical School. He's a Fellow of the American and Royal Colleges of Physicians, has served as advisor to the House of Lords Committee Against Euthanasia and on the Medical Ethics Committee here at UCLA. His medical interests include, among others, pain management. So let's welcome Dr. Conolly.
All right, now is that loud enough to disturb your sleep? Okay. Well, when C.S. Lewis, one of my literary heroes, was asked to write a book dealing with the problem of pain or of human suffering, he asked his publisher if he could be allowed to write it anonymously. Happily, the publisher refused, and the book called The Problem of Pain has become an enduring classic for many of us. Well, like C.S. Lewis, when I found myself confronted with having to tackle a similar topic, I did ask Kyle and the other organizers if I could wear a false beard in order to make my presentation. But arguing that people who paid as much to get in here as you have are entitled to see who it is who doesn't have the answers to the question he poses, I was denied the right to a beard. So you're going to have to put up with me as I am, knowing that I bring more questions than I have answers, and knowing also that there are others far better qualified than I am to delve into the philosophy of such matters. However, nobody can be involved in the practice of medicine for any length of time, and particularly the field of pain management, especially as it applies to dying patients, without asking questions that have no answers. Now, were I to delve into everything that's been written from a philosophical point of view, and then present it to you in the time available, and I'm only given 2 hours for this presentation, I think it would leave you feeling as though, in the words of Dr. Ravi Zacharias, you'd been given a drink from a fire hydrant. Fortunately for you, though, I don't have the intellectual skills to do that, and so what I want to do today is just to present a more personal perspective on these issues, to share with you some thoughts that I've had along the way, and to share also some of those things that my patients have shared with me. Now, before launching into my topic proper, I want you to come on a journey with me. Let us go back some 2,500 years. Let us, in the days of the Jewish exile in Babylon, go to the desert, and let us stand there in Babylon outside a great furnace as King Nebuchadnezzar angrily addresses 3 of his insubordinate Jewish captives. The text says, "I will give you one more chance. When the music plays, if you fall down and worship the statue, all will be well. But if you refuse, you will be thrown into a flaming furnace within the hour. And what God can deliver you out of my hands then?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we're not worried about what will happen to us. If we are thrown into the flaming furnace, our God is able to deliver us, and he will deliver us out of your hand. But if he doesn't, please understand, sir, that even then we will not under any circumstances serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have erected." Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and his face became dark with anger at Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He commanded that the furnace be heated up 7 times hotter than usual, and called for some of the strongest men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the fire. And so they bound them tight with ropes and threw them into the furnace fully clothed. And because the king, in his anger, had demanded such a hot fire in the furnace, the flames leaped out and killed the soldiers as they threw them in. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego fell down bound into the roaring flames. But suddenly, as he was watching, Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in amazement and exclaimed to his advisors, "Didn't we throw 3 men into the furnace?" "Yes," they said, "we did indeed, your majesty." "Well, look," Nebuchadnezzar shouted, "I see 4 men walking around unbound. And they aren't even hurt by the flames, and the 4th man looks like a god." Then Nebuchadnezzar came as close as he could to the open door of the flaming furnace and yelled, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servant of the Most High God, come out, come here." So they stepped out of the fire. Then the princes, governors, captains, and counselors crowded around them and saw that the fire hadn't even touched them. Not a hair of their head was singed, their coats were unscorched, and they did not even smell of smoke. Come with me now on another journey. Let's leave behind the comforting warmth of Iraq and move forward in time some 2,400 years. Travel with me to the Antarctic autumn of 1919. One of the great polar explorers of that time, Ernest Shackleton, was in a desperate situation. His ship, the Endurance, had been crushed by the ice floes and sunk, and he and his fellows were stranded, without radio, with little chance of rescue. His only hope was to row with 5 companions in a small, open lifeboat across the Antarctic Ocean to the small island of South Georgia, where he might get help from a whaling ship. The 850-mile journey through incredible freezing hardship, hurricane-force winds and gigantic waves took 16 days, at the end of which time they were exhausted and dehydrated. Only 3 of them were fit enough to attempt the trek across the uncharted interior of the island to reach the whaling station. The way was barred by a 5-peaked, unnamed mountain range, and 3 times they had to retrace their steps in their attempts to find a pass between the peaks, which led them only to impassable cliffs. Until finally, after a hair-raising slide in the dark down the last pass that they could attempt, they finally reached their destination. Looking back on that perilous trip, Shackleton said, "I know that during that long and racking march of 36 hours over the unnamed mountains and glaciers of South Georgia, it seemed to me often that we were 4, not 3. Well, now to pain. How are we to approach pain? Well, I want to approach it on 2 fronts. I want to ask, what are we to think about it? And secondly, what are we to do about it? Now, of course, it's true, as C.S. Lewis points out, that probably 4/5 of human pain is caused by man. It's men, not God, says Lewis, who have produced racks, whips, prisons, slavery, guns, bayonets, and bombs. It's by human avarice or stupidity, not by the churlishness of nature, that we have poverty and overwork, end quote. Now, obviously, as long as man is to have effective free will, the universe around him has to remain constant. Wood, which has to be hard to hold my roof up, will remain hard if I choose to make out of it a club with which to hit somebody. If the world were to be other than that, I would have no effective free will. And I think all of that's clear enough. However, I don't think that's where the real dilemma lies. The problem is, to take the title of a book which first appeared about 20 years ago, what do we say when, quotes, bad things happen to good people? Now, the man who wrote the book reduced the dilemma to one of 2 options. Either God is omnipotent, but not wholly good, or he's wholly good, but he's not omnipotent. And the writer of this book opted for the latter. Let me suggest to you, however, that there is a third way. I think we can have our theological cake and eat it too, because I believe that Scripture teaches us that God is sovereign and also wholly good. However, in adhering to this view, I think we have to abandon some of the cop-out positions we sometimes slide into when we talk of God allowing things to happen or his being limited by man's free will. Now, to a degree, I think the latter proposition may have some truth in it, but I've come to believe that God is a far more active agent than that in the causation of incomprehensible and painful things. And I don't have a lot of time or knowledge to dwell on this aspect, but let's just look at a few scriptures. Let's go back to Exodus and remember the time when Moses was standing in front of the burning bush, and he'd been given his marching orders. He was told he was to lead the children of Israel out of Egypt to the promised land. Not a prospect which thrilled him at the time, and he tried all sorts of ways to talk himself out of a job. His trump card, as I recall, was the fact that he had some kind of a speech impediment, an excuse which, of course, God instantly brushed aside. But notice how God did it. Who made mouths? Jehovah asked him. Who makes a man so that he can speak or not speak? To see or not see? To hear or not hear? Isn't it I, the Lord? Interesting acceptance of responsibility. Now, life, of course, has many twists and turns, not all of which we like. And the book of Ecclesiastes talks about this. It says, enjoy prosperity whenever you can, and when hard times strike, realize that God gives one as well as the other, so that everyone will realize that nothing is certain in this life. In the book of Isaiah, or Isaiah as you will say it here, God says, I form the light and I make the dark. I send good times and bad. I, Jehovah, am he who does these things. And we have no control over these issues. In Lamentations 3:37, it says, who can speak and have it happen if the Lord has not decreed it? Now, my wife, who's just come in, gave me strict instructions not to be too depressing in pursuing this line of thought. And she's right, of course, because although our sovereign God does orchestrate things in our lives which are not to our liking, if they're bad things, he doesn't do it gladly, and nor does he abandon us in the process, but he has a plan for us. Lamentations 3:31, for men are not cast off by the Lord forever. Though he brings grief, he will show compassion, so great is his unfailing love. And this is a verse beloved of my late father-in-law. He does not willingly bring affliction or grief to the children of men. And in Jeremiah, God says, I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. So he doesn't abandon us. And neither, and this is important to the latter part of my talk, does he expect us as his agents to abandon or shortchange our patients in the time of their need. Now sometimes, but I think not always, we can see how there might be a reason behind pain. In one of the more closely reasoned and difficult passages in his book, The Problem of Pain, C.S. Lewis puts it like this, and bear with me if I give you a rather lengthy quotation. He says, but what then can God do in our interest but makes, quotes, our own life less agreeable to us and take away the plausible sources of false happiness? It is just here where God's providence seems at first to be most cruel that the divine humility, the stooping down of the highest, most deserves praise. We are perplexed to see misfortunes falling upon decent, innocent, inoffensive, worthy people, on capable, hard-working mothers of families, or diligent, thrifty little tradespeople, on those who have worked so hard and so honestly for their modest stock of happiness, and now seem to be entering on the enjoyment of it with the fullest right. How can I say, with sufficient tenderness, what here needs to be said? It does not matter that I know that I must become, in the eyes of every hostile reader, as it were, personally responsible for all the sufferings I try to explain, but it matters enormously if I alienate anyone from the truth. Let me implore the reader to try and believe, if only for a moment, that God, who made these deserving people, may really be right when he thinks that their modest prosperity and the happiness of their children are not enough to make them blessed, that all this must fall from them in the end, and that if they have not learned to know him, they will be wretched. And therefore he troubles them, warning them in advance of an insufficiency that one day they will have to discover. The life to themselves and their families stand between them and the recognition of their need. He makes that life less sweet to them. I call this a divine humility because it's a poor thing to strike our colors to God when the ship is going down under us. a poor thing to come to him as a last resort, to offer our own when it is no longer worth keeping. If God were proud, he would hardly have us on such terms. But he's not proud. He stoops to conquer. He will have us even though we have shown that we prefer everything else to him, and come to him because there is nothing better now to be had. This same humility is shown by all those divine appeals to our fears which trouble high-minded readers of Scripture. It's hardly complimentary to God that we should choose him as an alternative to hell, yet even this he accepts. The creature's illusion of self-sufficiency must, for the creature's sake, be shattered, and by trouble or fear of troubles on earth, by crude fear of the eternal flames, God shatters it, unmindful of his glory's diminution. Those who would like the God of Scripture to be more purely ethical don't know what they ask. If God were a Kantian and would not have us until we came to him with the purest and best motives, who could be saved? And this illusion of self-sufficiency may be at its strongest in some very honest, kindly, and temperate people, and on such people, therefore, misfortune must fall. The dangers of apparent self-sufficiency explain why our Lord regards the vices of the feckless and the dissipated so much more leniently than the vices that lead to worldly success. Prostitutes are in no danger of finding their present life so satisfactory that they cannot turn to God. The proud, the avaricious, and the self-righteous are. Well, as far as it goes, that's well and good. However, we don't have to look very far before we find situations where such an explanation hardly fits. An incident that's burned for all times on my memory is a tragedy which occurred in South Wales in 1966. Even in this audience, the naming of the mining village, the name of the mining village where the tragedy occurred may be known to some. That village was Aberfan. And on the morning of October the 16th, 1966, a water-laden waste tip from a coal mine slid down the hill into the village and engulfed a school, killing 5 teachers and 109 small children. Now, God gives us no answer to the question why when confronted by such a tragedy, any more than he answered the same question from Job at the end of his time of tribulations. And interestingly, even C.S. Lewis, whom I've just quoted with that other set of answers, he also asked the question why when he was considering the death of his wife. If you've never read a book called A Grief Observed, I commend it to you. But like Job and like the villagers of Aberfan, Lewis got no answer. But his interpretation of God's silence is helpful. He said, when I lay these questions before God, I get no answer. But a rather special sort of no answer. It's not the locked door. It's more like a silent, certainly not uncompassionate gaze, as though he shook his head not in refusal, but waiving the question, like, peace, child, you don't understand. And I think there are many, many people throughout history who go through life not understanding, not knowing, not being certain of the validity, the worth of what was happening to them. Did John the Baptist, I wonder, have a degree of certainty when his head was lopped off in prison? Didn't he think he was called to be Elijah, and did he not have reason to think he still had a role to play? But it came to an end. One of the great Protestant reformers in Britain, Hugh Latimer, was burned to death in the city of Oxford, along with his companion Ridley. And in fact, there's still in the street a stone cross which marks the spot on which it happened. And as they were being led to the stake, Latimer said to Ridley, "Be of good cheer, Master Ridley, and play the man, for I pray that this day we will light a candle that will not, I trust, be put out. He didn't know. He knew he was going to die, but he didn't know what the consequence would be. He just had to trust. It's like, well, we're in a war, aren't we? And it's like being, the soldier in the foxhole. High command is not going to tell you what's going on. High command just tells you to get on with it, do your job, fight. If you get killed, you get killed. But that's all part of the plan. And in a sense, although I can't extrapolate too far from human affairs to the divine way of running the universe, which is totally beyond my comprehension, I think it is a bit like that. And here I want to leave this aspect of the incomprehensible, because I just don't have the intellectual equipment to delve any further. And all I can do is say with St. Paul, now all we see are like puzzling reflections in a mirror. I want to turn now to the much simpler aspect of the problem of pain, and that is to address what we should do about it. For a paradox in Christianity is that although poverty is called blessed, we are called upon to alleviate it. And while pain may be what C.S. Lewis termed God's megaphone, the example set by Jesus was a ministry of healing and relief. Not for nothing are the two greatest teaching hospitals in London, St. Bartholomew's and St. Thomas's, descended from monastic foundations, both established in 1172, by comparison with which, of course, this upstart medical school's first coat of paint is barely dry. But from monasteries to Mother Teresa, the call is to the relief of pain, the treatment of the body, as well as the cure of souls. Now let me take as my springboard the issue of euthanasia, and this is topical for two reasons. One is because it's recently formally been legalized in Holland, and the other is because it's been a ballot initiative here in this state in the past, and will, I'm told, appear here again soon once more. Judging by what I observed in my children when they were younger, television and those dreadful computer games that simply devour time have had the effect of reducing the average person's attention span to that of a rather somnolent newt. And our style of thinking has become perilously truncated. If the secrets of the universe cannot be contained in a 30-second soundbite, it simply will not be considered. And any philosophy which is to gain widespread credence must be capable of fitting within the confines of a bumper sticker. Now, these ubiquitous devices have accustomed us to the idea of trite and simplistic solutions to all of life's problems. You know the kind of thing, keep your town clean, eat a pigeon for lunch. And another probably devised by the American Medical Association was an apple a day is bad for business. Well, in order to try and resolve the awfulness which terminal illness can represent, euthanasia is frequently trotted out by many as the bumper sticker solution to the problem. And very typical of this was the thinking displayed by one Robert Risley, who was at one time the leading proponent of something called the California Humane Death Initiative, one which happily never gathered enough signatures to make it to the ballot. Anyway, back to Mr. Risley and his organization, which he called Americans Against Human Suffering. And by the way, who in this country would not consider themselves Americans Against Human Suffering, except perhaps drug pushers? I mean, it really upsets me the way he sort of arrogates that title to his own narrow agenda and says that, if you're an American against human suffering, ipso facto, you must stand foursquare with him. Well, let's look at some of the things he said in the promotional letter that he sent round, now of historical interest, but yet the same sort of stuff keeps recycling like onions in a Hungarian goulash. 2 years ago, he wrote, my wife died. Her pain was extraordinary. She was forced to suffer. We knew her last days would either be clouded by drugs or be spent clenching her fists to fight the pain. Even when a doctor knows that hope is gone, he must legally keep his patients alive on machines regardless of what the patient wants. That is why I formed Americans Against Human Suffering, to change these laws. A terminal person will have the right to ask a physician to administer aid in dying. Please act today. Every day we wait is another day of pain and suffering for another terminally ill patient. Now, these assertions are so far wide of the mark as to be laughable were the issues not so serious. And if any physician exhibited the same ignorance of medicine as Mr. Risley, who I believe was an attorney, did of the law, he'd be served with so many malpractice suits that he'd probably have to leave the country. Now, I personally am convinced that euthanasia, as advocated by Mr. Risley and many others like him, is truly a Pandora's box of woes, worse than no solution at all. And I give you at least 10 good reasons why I think we should not even contemplate voluntary active euthanasia. I'll give you these in sort of outline form, and then I'll return to them in more detail after that. Firstly, I think legalization of euthanasia would open floodgates of abuse that we would never be able to close again. Secondly, the appalling price of medical care more or less guarantees that if the option of legalized suicide existed, there are many who would be obligated to take that route. Thirdly, those who habitually put the interests of others before their own will be pressured by the thought that in order to spare their families more trouble and expense, they ought to do away with themselves. Fourth, trust, which at present amazingly still undergirds the doctor-patient relationship, will necessarily be eroded, as we are in fact seeing in Holland. Five, cutting the time of potential reconciliation short by euthanasia would do great harm both to the patient and to their families. Six, guilt, which often haunts surviving relatives of suicide victims, will likely afflict many relatives after euthanasia too. Reason number 7, history is littered with examples of diseases that were once held to be incurable. Suicide, of course, forever closes the door on hope of a new breakthrough or on one of those admittedly rare instances of spontaneous remission which can occur in certain diseases. Reason number 8, although I prefer not to talk about it too much, doctors do sometimes make mistakes in diagnosis. Reason number 9, large areas of medicine would be closed off to those who, on principle, refuse to take part in assisted suicides. And 10, the call for euthanasia is commonly based, as Risley's letter shows, on the mistaken notion that the terminally ill are bound to suffer horribly, and that this suffering can only be relieved by death. Well, let me now discuss each of these 10 items in more detail. Firstly, I submit that legalization of euthanasia will open doors that we will not be able to close again. Now, we have seen in the context of abortion, which I'm not here to discuss today, how once the principle of the inviolability of the fetus was compromised, albeit for narrowly defined reasons, that exception after exception has been insisted upon, and step by step the indications have been exposed, until now we have a situation where at least 1.5 million viable fetuses are aborted each year in this country alone. Now, as I say, I'm not here to discuss that, but since we're dealing with issues of life and death, I think it's fair to draw the parallel. And if euthanasia is to be available to one, it's got to be available to all. And in the light of what's happened with abortion, I have no confidence whatever in any safeguards that might be built in. You know, once euthanasia has been legalized, it's not going to be very long before someone will argue that many comatose or paralyzed patients, quotes, would certainly agree to it if they were lucid enough, close quotes. And so why shouldn't a close relative or some appointed person with a durable power of attorney make the decision for them? But you know, people change their minds. Supposing there was a still aware but speechless person, maybe a stroke victim, who didn't want to be euthanized, but he'd signed the paper and he couldn't speak and his deputy was about to, just too terrible to think about. Now, I don't share the disdain for the slippery slope argument, which many do, but whether it be a slope that we're walking down or a precipice we're being asked to step over, I am a devout believer in gravity. Once we start, there's only one place we can stop, and that's right down at the bottom. And we need to remind ourselves that the obscenities of the Third Reich did not begin with the final solution, which found its expression in the gas chambers of Dachau and Auschwitz and Treblinka and all those other places. Of that phenomenon, a man called Leo Alexander, an Austrian who interviewed many of the Nazi war criminals at the end of the war, and his findings were published in the New England Journal of Medicine in, I believe, 1949. Of that, he said, the infinitely small lever from which this entire trend received its impetus was the attitude towards the non-rehabilitable sick. And it's also instructive to note that this change of attitude was introduced not by the Nazi regime. It was the 19th century philosophers like Nietzsche who espoused the idea of a life not worth living, and thereby left such a devastating tool for the Nazis to develop. And we all know the progression from terminally ill to deformed to mentally ill to the unproductive to the religiously inconvenient, and finally, of course, to the ethnically unacceptable. Viktor Frankl, a remarkable man, a survivor of the Holocaust, who at one point chose to remain in a concentration camp when he might have been released so that he could minister to a dying comrade, he remarked that if we present man as an automaton of reflexes, a mind machine and a bundle of instincts, drives, and reactions, the mere product of heredity and environment, we would then feed the nihilism which modern man is in any case prone to. He went on to say, I became acquainted with the last stage of this corruption in my second concentration camp, Auschwitz. The gas chambers of Auschwitz were the ultimate consequence of the theory that man is nothing but the product of heredity and environment. I am absolutely convinced, he said, that the gas chambers Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Majdanek were ultimately prepared not in some ministry or other in Berlin, but rather at the desks and in the lecture halls of nihilistic scientists and philosophers. Now herein, of course, lies the crucial importance of Veritas, to counter these ever-present tendencies in us and in the sort of university thinking. There is a stand to be made. There is a standard to be upheld. And in Germany, in the 19th century, 20th century, it was not. As Santayana has aptly said, those who refuse to learn the lessons of history condemn themselves to repeating them. Now, my second reason for opposing euthanasia has to do with the appalling price of medical care in this country and the very, very inadequate means that some people have of meeting these costs, something that managed care has shown itself quite unable to remedy. Now, this more or less guarantees that if the option of legalized suicide existed, many would be obliged to take that route. Not to put too fine a point on it, it's clear that the people most vulnerable to this artificial necessity are going to include the old and the unwanted, the poor, the unemployed, and the numerous ethnic groups who've traditionally always been on the lowest economic rungs of our social ladder. And alas, healthcare which is based only on rational principles and economy and not on human compassion and a profound respect for human life, and I can tell you these days with managed care it is not, they're pushing us inexorably in this direction, and the unevenness with which healthcare is delivered is a disgrace. I can see Watts and Harlem being engulfed in a tidal wave of euthanasia before the first ripples ever touched the shores of Martha's Vineyard in Malibu. Now, I'm not here arguing for any particular party or any particular political philosophy, because I'm far from convinced that either side has got it right. Nonetheless, this has to be an issue which we address, because it's cruel to argue that respect of life prohibits euthanasia, as I believe it does, if we then, by neglect, condemn the dying to struggle through a hell on earth where, for instance, decent nursing home care cannot be had. And as we watch events unfold in Holland, we see how euthanasia is being applied to more than the original group of patients it was intended for. And we see a softening of the public stance towards it. In a recent survey of economic students, 90% of them thought that euthanasia was a reasonable means of containing healthcare costs. And given the prevailing panic in this country, about the steadily rising healthcare costs, it's hard to imagine that the same thought is not going to cross the political mind in Washington if euthanasia ever became a legal option here. Be careful whose fruit juice you drink. Thirdly, as a derivative of this, we need to remember that there are very many special people who always think about others before themselves. For such people, if euthanasia were to be unleashed, a new and horrible pressure is going to be put upon them. The thought that in order to spare their family expense and trouble, they ought to do away with themselves. The dying patient has got enough to contend with without having to cope with that kind of thing. How dare we unleash this on them, and that grotesquely in the name of compassion? It's supremely ironic that Anne Humphrey, the second wife and co-founder with Derek Humphrey of the Hemlock Society for Voluntary Euthanasia, like his first wife, unfortunately developed breast cancer. And faced with a mortal disease herself, she became convinced that legalized euthanasia could put, and here I quote her own words, put subtle but unmistakable pressure on someone to die, to get out of the way. And tragically, alone in the woods of Oregon, she ultimately did just that. Now, fourthly, trust, which at present still undergirds the doctor-patient relationship, will necessarily be eroded if the possibility existed of the doctor administering some kind of legalized coup de grace. To give you an example of how important trust is, even in a society which hasn't legalized euthanasia yet, let me tell you a true story. A number of years ago, I went to Scotland, and I met a man called Derek Doyle. And of all the people who work in the hospice aspect of medicine in Britain, he's the person who impressed me most. He'd been a leader in this field, and he was a vigorous opponent of euthanasia, and he'd often done battle in public debate with a senior official of the Voluntary Euthanasia Society in Britain. So you can imagine his surprise when one day he was approached by this very same official from the Voluntary Euthanasia Society, who had had the misfortune to develop incurable cancer. Well, surely, Derek Doyle said, there must be some mistake here. I mean, you know how I feel about euthanasia, and I know what your views are. I know them all too well. Oh, no, said the euthanasia man, there's been no mistake. Those things that I said about euthanasia were what I said when I was well. But now that I'm ill, I want a doctor that I can trust. So we do well to look at what's happening in Holland just now, where euthanasia has long been practiced and now formally legalized. And we see all too clearly the notion of it being voluntary is on the decline, to the point where many elderly people are afraid to consult a doctor. They are afraid to be hospitalized. And if reports in the LA Times are to be believed, euthanasia is being done on a non-voluntary basis, with falsification of death certificates to give the appearance of death from natural causes. And further, in Holland, now euthanasia is being advocated for chronic, non-terminal illnesses. It's indeed a supreme irony, isn't it, that in the one country in Europe where the physicians refused to go along with the Nazi program for exterminating unwanted people, Holland, where they just handed in their medical licenses rather than practice under that regime, their children are now the ones who have led the Western world in this awful practice. Now, fifthly, patients are very rarely an isolated entity. Usually a patient is part of a web of relationships. And if his family situation is anything like mine, and I dare say anything like yours too, there will be grievances to be sorted out. No, not with you. There'll be sins to be forgiven, and apologies and reconciliations to be made. And as Cicely Saunders put it a little while ago, we mustn't lose the chance of making good on a great deal of untidiness in our lives, or making time to pack our bags and say sorry, goodbye, and thank you. Experience has shown that the last few weeks or months of life can sometimes be a time of very enormous healing, crucial to the peace of mind of the one facing death, and vital for those who soon will have to work through the grieving process. and when a hostile man can embrace an antagonistic mother-in-law in the closing hours of life of the young woman they both loved, some good has been achieved. When two brothers who haven't spoken for 20 years walk arm in arm from their dying mother's bed, healing has taken place. To amputate this process by prematurely terminating the patient's existence will do more harm than good in most cases. Do we have the wisdom to know when every inch of possible forgiveness and healing has been drawn out of a given situation? I very much doubt it. And people who work with the terminally ill are convinced that cutting the time of reconciliation short by euthanasia would do great harm. Sixthly, those who counsel the relatives of more conventional suicide victims all attest to the almost universal feeling of guilt which haunts the surviving relatives. It's hard to see how this would be any less in a case with euthanasia. That feeling that if only they'd been more loving, if only they'd been more supportive, if only, but by then, of course, it will be too late. Seventh on my list is the observation that history is littered with examples of diseases once held to be incurable: leprosy, tuberculosis, pernicious anemia, malaria, diabetes, to name but a few. And to adopt euthanasia would be to take much of the urgency out of the research community. Would we, after all, have made even the modest progress that we have in the treatment of AIDS, with its humiliating and sometimes drawn-out death, if that had been managed by a program of compassionate slaughter? You only have to articulate the thought to realize the inappropriateness of it. Suicide, of course, forever closes the door on hope of a breakthrough or of remission. 8, contrary to what I've been led to believe as a medical student, MD stands only for Doctor of Medicine, not Mind of the Deity. I prefer not to talk about it too much, but as I've already indicated, we sometimes make mistakes in diagnoses, and not a few patients who go to autopsy are found to have died from something that could have been treated. What a tragedy if we offered and performed euthanasia on somebody on the basis of a wrong diagnosis. Now, my 9th argument springs from my recollection of what legalization of abortion did to many of my contemporaries in Britain back in the 60s and 70s, people who'd set their hearts on a career in obstetrics and gynecology, but who had moral objections to doing abortions. Now, regardless of the lip service paid to the conscience clause, as a result of a discreet directive from the Ministry of Health, and in Britain, of course, the government runs most of the hospitals, appointments were to be denied to people who had a moral objection to doing abortion. The hospital boards were told not to ask them why they wouldn't do it, because then that would open the NHS to the accusation that, oh, you're just not prepared to appoint me because I'm Catholic, or something like that. They would just, if they said they wouldn't do abortion, they just didn't get appointments. And so they either had to choose between not doing obstetrics or leaving the country. And if euthanasia came to be legalized, it would inevitably come to require medical participation, and then I fear large areas of medicine might be closed off to those who on principle would not take part in such action. Oncology, geriatrics, neonatology, and probably much of general internal medicine as well. And 10, the call for euthanasia is commonly based, as Risley's letter shows, on the erroneous belief that the terminally ill are bound to suffer horribly and that this suffering can only be relieved by death. Now, like all the lies and half-truths of Dr. Goebbels, this is in danger of being believed, if only because it is so often and so loudly trumpeted by the well-meaning souls of Hemlock and their kindred spirits, but it is nonetheless a false premise. At least it's false in the sense that it does not have to be so. For there's much that we can do, and no answer to the challenge of euthanasia would be effective, and indeed we have no right to answer it unless we can demonstrate that there is a humane alternative which can address the needs of mankind at this last stage. I think this is probably not the time to go into the technicalities of pain management, but there are certain things that I want to say about it. First of all, you don't just have somebody in pain. Pain is a very complex issue. Cicely Saunders, who really started the hospice movement in Britain and in Western Europe at all in the 1960s, points out that pain has several different components. There's mental pain, there's social pain, there's spiritual pain, as well as physical pain, and they all interact. And if you neglect 2 or 3 of those, it doesn't matter what you do about physical pain, you're not going to get patients comfortable. As far as mental pain is concerned, whenever you tell a patient that they've got a terminal illness and that thing which hurts them is what's going to kill them, they're thrown into what the psychiatrists call an existential crisis. They've got to come to terms with the fact that everything they'd hoped for, everything they dreamed of, everything they planned is now no longer possible. They've got to redefine their world in terms which are stark and unacceptable. This is difficult. And fear is an important component of this mental pain. And if you don't deal with that, then you're not going to help the patient's pain. I remember a young woman at UCLA. She developed intestinal obstruction. She had surgery, and at the surgery it was found that a rectal carcinoma that she'd had some years ago had recurred and was now no longer operable. And the moment she learned what her situation was, and there was no hope for cure, her subjective complaint of pain and her need for opiates escalated very sharply. We find that our patients are afraid of uncontrolled pain. They're afraid of choking to death. They're afraid of dying alone. And mental pain expresses itself in different ways at different times, and Elizabeth Kubler-Ross has become well known for writing about this. And I know of no one who follows the neat sequence of events that she describes, except perhaps Homer Simpson. But we always find in these people elements of denial, of anger, of bargaining, of depression and acceptance. And patients can flip-flop back from one to the other. And we just have to know that as we work with them. And, you know, at St. Christopher's Hospice, they do such a wonderful work. They promise their patients that they will never, ever be left alone. And they honor that promise. They use volunteers, they use all sorts of people to do that, but it means such a lot to those patients. You know, I think we so underestimate the importance of just being there for the patients. Some years ago, it fell to me to preside over the last 2 months of life of a man dying of an esophageal carcinoma. He was a very articulate Irishman, and he was grieving over his rapidly waning vitality. And, you know, painfully aware of my inability to influence the course of his disease at all, I said, "Jerry, I wish I could do more for you." And without a moment's hesitation, he said, "Oh," he says, "you've done a great deal. You've listened to me." I wonder how often we let slip the opportunity to render so simple yet so important a service to those who need it. Impotent to change the course of events we may be, but armed with the solace of a listening ear, empty-handed we are not. Social pain. Pain may arise as a patient contemplates the world from which he'll soon depart, and in the process of doing so, losing control and having to hand over decision-making to other family members. We need to facilitate this matter. If patient's been the breadwinner, he may have anxiety for his family when he can no longer be there. As a provider, has he done enough? Will the family have to live in reduced circumstances? Will there be problems in relation to housing and college fees? I wish I could say that there were great social resources that this wealthiest country in the world can marshal for such people, but as you know, there's precious little there. Spiritual pain, I think, speaks for itself. Ours is not an age which will be remembered by history for the depths of its religious insights. Most people don't consider the eternal order of things until it becomes all too apparent that their own immediate future is bound up in it. I don't suggest that good terminal care is to be regarded as a vehicle for proselytizing. I think, on the contrary, we have to accept people where they are and as they are, religious and irreligious alike. Nevertheless, in a society like ours, many people will have roots, albeit sometimes deeply buried, will have roots in either the Jewish or the Christian faith, and we need to remain sensitive to those patients who seek solace in that direction. You know, I remember a lady who, when I first saw her, she had advanced malignancy. I think it's wonderful how patients sometimes retain their sense of humor. She said, "You know, my bone scan lights up like a Christmas tree." And then she added, And for a Jewish woman, that's very bad news. So anyway, I asked her if that was her background, whether she'd like to speak to our rabbi. And this she firmly rejected, because she said, okay, look, genetically I'm Jewish, but I'm totally agnostic. I like it that way. Leave it alone. Okay, lady, you're the customer. That's what we'll do. But on her last lucid night of life, she suddenly became tremendously concerned with issues of forgiveness and reconciliation. And I remember sharing with her one of the verses from 103rd Psalm, as far as east is from west, so far has he removed our transgressions from us. And she found that to be, that really sort of ministered to her soul. Wasn't a situation where I felt I could assault her with the good news of the gospel, as it were. I think sometimes you just have to share with people what they understand, what they can take in. And so that was something that helped her. For some people, the traditional 23rd Psalm, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. But sometimes, although patients may be steeped in this, they forget. I had a man once who had been a sort of medical missionary for many years abroad. And I don't doubt the sincerity of his faith. I don't doubt the depth of his scriptural knowledge. But he'd been sick for a long time, and he was losing his grip on it. And yet, I had the opportunity of sharing with him those timeless words of St. Paul. I am persuaded that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, things present or things to come, nothing in all creation can separate us from the love of God which is in Christ Jesus our Lord. I may not have got the quote exactly right, but he wasn't critical. But I mean, that was helpful to him. And sometimes it's not that formal. I was talking to one lady late one night, a lot of pain in her neck, cancer, and she's having a difficult time. And I don't know why I said it, except that I knew that she had a strong personal faith. I said, in spite of everything, I really believe God loves you. And she sort of smiled, didn't say very much. And when I'd finished doing all my stuff with her, I said, well, is there anything else I can do for you before I go? And she said, yes, tell me again how much God loves me. And I said to her, I think he wants to wrap you up in his love. And she blew me away. Her next words were, oh, that's what it is. And I'd been calling it a blanket. So these are areas not to be forced, but if we have got something we can share, and if the patients want to share it, I think that's what we should do. Control of physical pain is perhaps the easiest of the things we have to deal with. I think time is moving on, and I should not dwell on that. But I do just want to make the point that it's complicated, of course. People have to know what they're doing. But the foundation stone for management of all severe pain is usually the narcotic analgesics. We've had morphine for 5,000 years, and we still don't have anything better. I mean, there are molecular variations on the theme, but it's basically the same drug. But it is so pathetically used. We hear people saying, oh, I don't want to give you morphine because if I do, when we really need it, it will have lost its effect. Boulder Dash. We hear people saying, I'm afraid if I turn you into morphine, I might turn you into a drug addict. What nonsense. First of all, it doesn't happen. People who take opiates for the relief of pain do not become addicted. And even if it did, what would it matter? No dying person is going to be going out and becoming part of the vicious street subculture of narcotic trafficking. Such nonsense, such utter nonsense. And then the worst attitude of all, on this ward we make our patients earn their morphine. Well, Do we make a diabetic earn their insulin by going into coma? Do we make a hypertensive have a stroke before we believe they need treatment? Of course we don't. Why should we be so different and so punitive about morphine? I think another reason why physicians don't want to get involved in prescribing narcotics is that when we prescribe narcotics, we do it on what's called a triplicate prescription. There are 3 parts to it. The doctor keeps the carbon copy at the bottom, the pharmacist keeps the middle copy, and the top copy goes to the big computer in the sky. Big Brother up in Sacramento has a large shoebox into which he throws all these prescriptions. But the fear has always been that if patients start prescribing narcotics and those triplicate prescriptions go up to Sacramento, that the Sheriff of Nottingham is going to come down here and cart them off in chains for daring to prescribe these things. And that was the case at one time. You know, the medical boards throughout this country have committed a great sin against the people of this land in the way that they have intimidated physicians from using narcotics. Now, happily, saner counsels prevail now, but the damage has been done. And, you know, I have one friend of mine, a neurosurgeon, involved in pain management. I've known him and worked with him for probably 8 or 10 years, and he proudly says, I have only ever once written a triplicate prescription, and that was just for another physician who'd run out of his. So, another barrier, of course, is fear of malpractice litigation. You know, such is the deformed attitude of our society that if something goes wrong, immediately an attorney will be on your doorstep, and he will say to you, you gave him narcotics? You gave him how much? You know, never mind that it was appropriate, never mind that it was what the guy needed. You gave him how much? And I myself had such a situation. They say there are 2 kinds of physicians in Los Angeles, those who've been sued and those who are going to be sued. Anyway, I had a young man who had chronic pain, and I was treating it with narcotics and keeping the pain under control. And then he left my practice, went to live in another state, and about a month later, suddenly and unexpectedly died. It never seemed to me that his death was drug-related, but that didn't deter at least one member of the worthy legal profession who filed a suit against me. Now, I mention this in part to illustrate the fact that God is not limited to physical illness if he needs to engineer a little pain into someone's life for educational purposes. And I would add, he's no less faithful in seeing us through it. This was something which for me dragged on about 4 years because the legal profession have a wonderful word. They talk about things being continued. And by continued, they actually mean being stopped and put off till some other day, usually 6 months down the road. Shakespeare indeed was right when he talked about the law's delay. Anyway, this went on for 4 years. And key to my surviving this storm was having a praying wife with praying friends who did battle for me in their prayers. And one member of this group, and I refer to this group very reverentially as the Sacred Ladies because they have done such wonderful things with prayer, was given a picture of Jesus going through the list of accusations against me, striking them out one after another. And it was so in the courtroom. My attorney put a thing up on the board, put the accusations there, and as she presented her arguments, she struck out one after the other. And in the end, a unanimous jury took 5 minutes to decide in my favor. So I guess I learned 2 things from that. One is, God stays with us in our troubles. The other is, if you don't have a praying spouse, get one. If you already have a spouse that doesn't pray, have it retrained. But anyway, I'm not sure that I want to say too much more about pain. I do want to object to the term Hemlock uses, passive euthanasia, when they talk about us treating patients' symptoms and not trying to cure them. And they say, well, you're just committing passive euthanasia by letting the patients die. Well, I think this is nonsense. I mean, first of all, we're not permitting the patients to die. With or without our permission, they're soon going to die. And secondly, in recognizing the futility of fighting to save a life that cannot be saved and changing the emphasis of therapy to symptom control, the intention is not to seek the patient's end. The intention is to relieve his pain, and uniformly, in the eyes of ethicists who debate these issues interminably, the question of intent is a crucial one. I think the term passive euthanasia is a hoax, and it comes from the same place as all other lies, and we shouldn't be afraid to dismiss it. There are other things we can do for pain that I don't have time to go into. Radiotherapy, orthopedics, nerve blocks, neurosurgery, a whole host of things which we could talk about another time. But I sincerely believe that the only way that we can defeat the kind of initiative which surfaced in California a while back and will return, even though last time it failed to qualify for the ballot, is to show America that there is a better way. In skilled hands, it's now well established that full control of pain can be achieved in 95% of patients with cancer pain. Of the 5% where we cannot, it's usually because they came too late for us to put everything in place before they actually die. For a patient to die with cancer pain is almost always a needless tragedy, and one which leaves behind in the mind of those close to the patient a terrible and terrifying legacy. But you know, there is a problem. We can't just say, amen, let's do it, because it will cost. And unless we're prepared to meet that cost, we have no authority to argue this issue. It takes time, it takes energy, it takes emotional resources, it takes manpower, and of course, it takes money. But I think we're at the point now where the march of history has left us with choices that we can no longer evade. We must now choose between the cup of hemlock or the chalice of compassion. We must now choose whether to open a Pandora's box that we can never again close, or resolutely commit ourselves to waging war against pain and suffering now and always, because within our grasp lie the instruments for either the eradication of pain or the swift extinction of mankind. To our generation falls the choice, and I have no doubt which is the better way. I've tried to show that God, far from being passive in our affairs, actively orchestrates good and bad. The pattern which it produces is mostly incomprehensible to us. A writer called Max Lucado put it this way. He said, "I suspect that the most consistent thing about life is its inconsistency. Choosing not to be neatly categorized, life has opted to be a tossed salad of tragedies and triumph, profanity and purity, despair and hope. The bad is perplexingly close to the good. The just is frighteningly near to the unfair. And life? Life is always a clock's tick away from death. And evil? Evil is paradoxically close to goodness. It's as if only a sheer curtain separates the two. Given the right lure at the right moment, aimed at the right weakness, there is not a person alive who wouldn't pull back his curtain and live out his vilest fantasy. The inconsistency of life. As a result, one moment can simultaneously usher in sweet victory and crushing defeat. The same day can bring both reunion and separation. The same birth can bring both pain and peace. Truth and half-truth often ride in the same saddle. If life were just simpler, we reason, more predictable, but it isn't. Even for the best among us, life is like a wild roller coaster ride of hairpin curves and diving dips. Yet it was in this inconsistency that God had his finest hour. Never did the obscene come so close to the holy as it did on Calvary. Never did the good in this world so tightly intertwine with the bad as it did on the cross. Never did what is right involve itself so intimately with what is wrong as when Jesus was suspended between heaven and earth. God on a cross, humanity at its worst, divinity at its best. Something is said at the cross about inconsistency, something hopeful, something healing. Simply stated, that which is consistent did battle with the inconsistent, and the consistent won. Something is said also about God himself. God is not stumped by an evil world. He doesn't gasp in amazement at the dearth of our faith or the depth of our failures. We can't surprise God with our cruelties. He knows the condition of the world and loves it just the same. For just when we find a place where God would never be, like on a cross, We look again, and there he is in the flesh. Let me end then where I began, in a Babylonian furnace. For into such, at different times, we are all thrown, always with a purpose, almost always one that we cannot discern, and one which God will not explain. Instead, he says something yet more wonderful. Together, he says, we can make it through. And I give you my word that I, the Alpha and Omega, the maker of heaven and earth, I, the everlasting one, will be the fourth man in your fire. Thank you. Can I go now? I don't know any answers. I thought I'd already made that clear. But,
Hi.
Hello.
Thanks for coming today, and thanks for your kind words. And I love your accent, incidentally.
I don't have one.
Well, I'm from New York, so it sounds like you have one. It sounds like you all do. Here's my problem. I'm not challenging you. I'm just trying to give you insight into how a typical non-Christian might think. The problem is, for me, on the one hand, what you're telling us seems to make sense. That wonderful book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People, the idea that God is there and God is watching as children die, as good, innocent people suffer. The writer of that book, interestingly, is Jewish and very liberal, if I understand it, so he wouldn't accept the Gospels. I can kind of buy into the idea that there's a God who watches all these horrible things happen, but giving us free will allows them still to happen. I guess my problem is we're at the Veritas Forum, so in the very next sentence, then Christians say, oh, but by the way, the Gospels are historically accurate. You have to believe all of that. So when it says that Jesus rose a baby girl back up to life, that's what happened. When it says Jesus came across people missing arms and legs, and he gave them the ability to spontaneously regrow new arms or new legs, or heal them of psychosis or paralysis or epilepsy, that really happened. You have to believe it. My question to you is, why did he stop doing that then? When you have a patient who, I believe used the terms, they had given up hope for a cure, why don't Christians just step forward and say, of course Jesus can cure you, let's do it right now?
Well, I mean, that is a good question, and you touch on a lot of complicated issues. But before I answer your question, the perspective that I have of God being involved in our problems, even if he doesn't turn them round the way I want, is not just mine and it's not just Christian. For instance, there's a guy called Elie Wiesel, who was a survivor from the Holocaust, had a lot to do with the Museum of Tolerance here. And he describes one dreadful episode where he and some of his colleagues were, fellow inmates, were called out to witness the execution of 3 Jewish men by hanging. There were 2 old guys and 1 young guy. And he said the 2 old guys died pretty quickly. But the younger guy didn't, and he was left hanging and thrashing on the end of the rope. And one of the other people standing behind Elie Wiesel muttered, God, where are you in all this? And this man said, Wiesel said, the same question came welling up in me, and then he said, and I heard a voice inside me saying, on the gallows, of course, where else? So what I'm trying to say is that I think both Jewish and Christian people, to a degree, share the belief that God involves himself in ways which we don't understand in the problems that we have. Now, why doesn't he intervene and do the miraculous is a question I've often asked myself. I mean, I do believe the gospel narratives when they talk about miraculous healing. I do believe that to a very limited extent it does occur today. I hear about it from people whose word I'm not inclined to challenge. I've never personally seen what I would regard as a complete miraculous cure myself. Why God would limit himself in that way, I cannot tell you. I mean, it would seem to me if I were running the universe, that would just be the most natural thing to do. Unfortunately, I haven't been offered the job, and so I don't have a good answer to that. But I mean, I thank you for asking, because it's a very valid question. But you know, so many things in this world, I think we don't have the equipment here to understand that which the infinite created. You know how sometimes we have little kids and they keep peppering us with why-type questions. Why can't I? Why should I? Why this? Why that? And there are reasons, but we can't explain it to them. And we just have to say, because I'm the daddy, you do what I tell you. So I can't give you an intellectually satisfying answer. Others here might be able to.
Thank you. My whole point then is not that I look down at you. I just hope that you don't look down at me simply because I don't see things the same way. The reason a lot of people don't believe in God and a lot of people don't believe in the Bible or Jesus is not because they're idiots, and you never said that. It's not because they haven't put the research into it. It's because there are real questions that haven't been answered to their satisfaction. You started off by this wonderful story of 3 men who survived burning in a furnace. I have no reason to believe that. I could be wrong. Last night there was a fictional show, Third Watch, I don't know if you've ever seen it, about firemen who rush into a burning building. What kind of a great world would we have? How wonderful would that be if our firemen could go in without raincoats, without water hoses, and rescue children who would otherwise die? So.
Well, you know, I just one thing occurred to me as you were talking about finding God or not finding.
I hope it's not that I'm going to hell.
No. Hey, that's not my call. But no, and it certainly wouldn't be God's will, because Ezekiel says he's not willing that any should perish, and that's one of your books. There's another thing in Jeremiah where God says of people looking for him, you know, if you invoke me, I will hear you. If you look for me, you will find me. When you seek for me with all your heart, I will let you find me, says the Lord. And I don't know how to define for anybody what seeking with all their heart is. I know that I'm often pretty half-hearted about it myself. That would be solely between you and God. But I do believe that if you continue to seek with all your heart, you will find, and then you will know. I would just encourage you to. I mean, particularly with your Jewish heritage, you have a special relationship with God, and he has a special place and a role for the Jewish people in his plan for the world. And actually, it's often a good idea to get in line with that plan, because God's plans are going ahead no matter what. And you can choose to be a part of it, or you can choose to be steamrolled by it. But it's, you know, just keep looking. Thank you, brother.
Also, is this on? Yeah. I wanted to respond a little bit to what he was saying. First of all, I'm not, you know, I've read all the Gospels. I've never come across a story of people spontaneously generating limbs or arms, or I'm not exactly sure what that's from, but yeah, if you could tell me, that'd be good, the verse, but I've never heard of that. In terms of, why, you know, would God allow this suffering still to happen? And, you know, in terms of even, say, when Jesus walked the earth, you know, the Gospels don't say that Jesus, you know, healed everybody. They don't say he fed everybody. As, you know, great a guy as, you know, I believe he is, I don't think that everyone in first century Palestine, you know, was healed or was fed. And this is troubling in a way to me, but I think, you know, the answer, you know, would be, well, you know, why didn't, you know, God do all of that? And I think, you know, part of it is that, you know, there's something for the rest of us to try to do, but also that the kingdom of God isn't just about feeding hungry people or healing sick people. I mean, that's part of it, but it goes beyond that, and it shouldn't just be reduced to some type of, humanistic, ideology of a utopia or something. I mean, heaven does, I think, start in this life, but it doesn't come to full fruition until an afterlife setting. So, but in terms of, the problem of evil, I think, whether or not we believe in God, we're still going to have this problem of evil. And I think, the Judeo-Christian message is the best way I've found to ever try to deal with it. But so I just wanted to have the comment more than a question to you, sir.
Yeah, and they're very complicated and multifaceted comments too. And there are a lot of things that we can't explain. If we try and put God in a box and say, well, no, you here and you do this, and it doesn't work that way. He's got other plans, and why he would heal some and not another, we will never know this side of kingdom come. It's too complicated. We don't have the data to process it, is what it is. And, a picture somebody gave me once, and I don't know if this is helpful, is that if you look at the back of a tapestry, all you'll see are a lot of colored strings going here, there, and everywhere, knots, cut ends, loose ends, bows, all sorts of things. And it makes no sense at all. And then you turn it round, and you see what the tapestry was all about. Then it makes sense. But we aren't there yet. We're still on the knotty side. I don't know if that helps. It's only a picture. All pictures have limitations. I think everybody else wants supper.
Hi. I understand that you're a doctor and that you've treated people from all walks of life, Christians and non-Christians.
Oh, sure.
And I was wondering if you were to treat, or if you had treated a terminally ill patient, or in that aspect, and they're non-Christians, how do you look at them in the eyes and say, in order to give them comfort, that they're going to a better place, considering that big Christian doctrine is that Christians go to heaven and that others don't?
Well, people live as they die as they live, and some people will not be responsive to you. And what I do with patients I have who are terminally ill is I make sure that I feel them out early on to see whether they have an interest, whether they're responsive. And sometimes it comes out in the most surprising ways. I remember once I was talking to a guy, he's a rough working class kind of guy, but he had an interesting past because he was a young man at the time of the Second World War, and he'd been a navigator flying planes that we had called Mosquitoes, or a bit like your P-39s in terms of performance and so forth. And he was a navigator in one of these, one of our, if you will, one of our aerial knights. And after the Second World War, he was just tossed aside by society, and he spent the rest of his days working as a parking lot attendant. Not a very happy calling, but anyway, he came into St. Christopher's Hospice when I was working there, and I didn't expect anything theological from this guy. He didn't talk like that, he didn't sound like that, the relatives that came with him certainly weren't like that. And, but while I was talking to him, and actually I wasn't trying to address the spiritual things, I was just dealing with his physical things. Oh, he says, I don't expect you to save me. Then he burst into tears and said, but Jesus will save me. I've believed that since I was a little boy. His relatives looked totally nonplussed. He clearly never talked to them about that in all the years they'd known him. But it was buried deep down inside him. So you never know. We can't force the issue. We can try and make opportunities. If there's a chance to share things, you can do that. But I think, in order not to compromise what I'm trying to do for things medically, I have to accept people as they wish to be accepted, religious or irreligious. If I made a guy feel that, I was only going to treat his pain if he signed on the dotted line and said he believed the gospel, I can't do that, So I just work with people as they are, and if they're strongly into another tradition, whether it be Jewish or Islam or Buddhism, it always seems to me that's not the time when I should be trying to twist their arms to go in another direction. How God deals with them, I don't know. I don't even know how God deals with my own relatives who had a Christian background but no Christian profession and died. I mean, I have to trust certain things. I have to trust if I prayed for them that prayer accords with His will and He's promised to hear that. But, you know, this side of the grave, I don't know. And, you know, I don't know how God gets people into the kingdom of heaven who haven't officially agreed to the, you know, assented to the gospel. There are things in Paul's letter to Romans which talk a bit about this. People who've never heard but yet have this internal witness within them to the truth, and if they responded to that, then you know, God takes that. But physically, there are many people who don't hear the gospel. I mean, in this country, shameful though it is, there are people who can go all the way through their life in this country and never actually darken the door of a church, never hear the gospel preached. It's pretty bad, really. But so, you know, you raise questions I don't have good answers to, and I take each patient as they come. I offer them what they will take, and then I just do the best for them that I can medically. Not a very satisfactory answer, but that's kind of where it is.
How do you feel about legalizing medical marijuana?
Well, marijuana, at least delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, is already legally available. And it's pretty unimpressive. I mean, I've prescribed it for people for relief of nausea and pain, and I just don't think it's particularly good. If you're talking about inhaling marijuana, I would not align myself with the people who campaign for it, because I suspect that a lot of them have a different set of motives. It's easy to say, oh, I want this for medical purposes, when in fact they just want to make it legally accessible for more recreational use. And marijuana, when smoked, is actually very damaging anyway. It's much worse for the lungs than tobacco smoke. So personally, I don't think it'd be a particularly smart thing to do. I wouldn't expend my time on it.
As the Bible is so clear about its subject of suicide and, you know, against God's will, how do Christian physicians who believe in euthanasia make a moral amends to that? I guess I don't.
Well, I don't know. I mean, if a physician says he's Christian and he supports that kind of thing, I don't know how carefully he's thought his way through it. You know, any more than physicians, surgeons who get involved in issues like gender reassignment. I mean, you know, what can be more clearly the will of God than you be what you're born, since He chose your genes and chromosomes and all that sort of thing. But yet there are people who do that, and I've never really sat down with them and asked them why they do what they do. But I guess what we need to know is what they really believe, as opposed to what they say they are, and then take it from there. But I've never discussed it with them, so I don't know how they reconcile their beliefs and their actions.
Have you had an opportunity to have a dialogue of any sort with Peter Singer or others in his camp?
For those of you who didn't hear the question, have I had a dialogue with Peter Singer? No, I haven't. I think it would be interesting. But he's somebody I've never met. They need feeding.